Harlem in those years breathed like a living thing, slow and heavy in the mornings, restless and electric after dark. A neighborhood that had learned how to endure without ever learning how to bow. The streets remembered everything, every promise broken, every song sung too loud, every injustice committed quietly and explained away later, and the buildings stood like old witnesses who had stopped testifying only because no one in power had ever bothered to listen. It was into this Harlem that Bumpy Johnson walked each day, not as a conqueror and never as a king, but as a man who understood that true authority does not announce itself. He moved with the calm of someone who had seen chaos up close and chosen discipline instead, someone who had learned that dignity, once lost, was harder to recover than money or reputation. People noticed him not because he demanded attention, but because his presence steadied rooms that had been shaking long before he arrived. Bumpy had learned early that the world was not fair, and he never pretended otherwise. Fairness, he believed, was a luxury preached by people who had never needed it to survive. What mattered more was respect earned, respect defended, and respect returned even when the world refused to offer it freely. He carried that belief into every conversation, every decision, every silence. Men who mistook loudness for strength never understood why he unnerved them, and men who understood power recognized him immediately. Harlem trusted him not because he was feared, but because he was consistent. And in a city bruised by broken systems, consistency felt like safety. His nephew, Isaiah, had grown up watching that steadiness with a mixture of admiration and distance. To Isaiah, Bumpy was not a legend or a symbol. He was simply Uncle Ellsworth, the man who spoke carefully and listened longer than anyone else. In the room, Isaiah was young enough to believe that the world might be changing, that the worst of the old hatreds were finally burning themselves out. He dressed neatly, spoke politely, and believed perhaps too much that decency could protect him. Bumpy never discouraged that belief, but he also never fed it illusions. He told Isaiah, gently and without bitterness, that kindness was powerful, but only when paired with awareness. The boy listened, nodded, and went on hoping anyway. The night everything began to fracture arrived without ceremony. It was humid, the kind of Harlem evening where voices carried farther than usual and tempers shortened without warning. Isaiah had been sent on an errand, nothing special, nothing dangerous, just a walk through streets he had known his whole life. What happened next was not dramatic in the way movies make violence dramatic. There were no crowds, no speeches, no heroic interruptions. There were only men who believed they could do whatever they wanted because history had taught them. They usually could, and a young man who learned too late that dignity alone does not always shield the vulnerable. By morning, the story had already begun to change. What neighbors whispered bore little resemblance to what would later be written down, and what would be written down would barely resemble the truth at all. Official language has a way of sanding cruelty into something smooth and harmless, and by the time Isaiah's name appeared on paper, it had already lost its weight. He was described as involved, as present, as uncooperative, words that hovered just close enough to blame without quite touching it. The men who had humiliated him walked freely, confident that the silence of institutions would protect them far better than masks or secrecy ever could. When Bumpy heard, he did not shout. He did not curse the world or threaten revenge. He sat in a chair, closed his eyes for a long moment, and let the truth settle into him the way cold settles into bone. Those who knew him best recognized that stillness has something dangerous, not because it preceded violence, but because it signaled calculation. Bumpy understood something that many men never learn. Anger clouds judgment, but composure sharpens it. He asked questions quietly, listened to answers without interruption, and thanked people even when their information hurt. By the time he rose, Harlem could feel that something had shifted, though no one yet knew how or where it would land. Isaiah did not speak much in those first days. Shame, when paired with injustice, has a way of sealing the throat. He sat in his mother's apartment, eyes lowered, hands folded, shrinking from the pity he saw reflected in every face. Bumpy visited him alone. He did not interrogate him or demand details. He spoke instead about breathing, about standing straight even when the world tries to bend you into something smaller, about how a man's worth is not decided by the cruelty he endures. Isaiah listened, tears forming silently, and for the first time since that night, he felt something loosen inside his chest. No promises were made. None were needed. Bumpy's presence carried assurance enough. Outside, Harlem watched carefully. People had seen cycles before: outrage, retaliation, crackdowns, and then the slow return to the same broken balance. What unsettled them this time was the absence of noise. Bumpy did not rally men or posture in public. He walked, observed, and waited. That waiting confused those who mistook patience for weakness. It also unnerved the authorities, who had learned how to manage anger but had no idea how to respond to dignity that refused to beg or threaten. The institutions responded the only way they knew how: by closing ranks. Complaints disappeared into filing cabinets. Officers spoke in rehearsed phrases that revealed nothing and admitted less. Doors that had once been open to conversation now closed politely but firmly. The message was clear, even if it was never spoken aloud. This was not a matter they intended to revisit. In that silence, the injustice deepened, because denial is not neutral, it is a decision. Harlem felt it like a tightening fist, and fear crept back into conversations that had only recently begun to hope. Bumpy understood that this was the real battle, not the act itself, but the attempt to erase it. He knew that violence would only confirm every expectation already waiting for him, and he refused to play the role others had written in advance. Instead, he did something far more difficult. He began to speak to people not about anger, but about memory. He reminded shopkeepers, pastors, and quiet men on stoops that forgetting was a luxury Harlem could not afford. He did not ask for loyalty. He asked for honesty. Slowly, carefully, stories resurfaced. Details sharpened. The truth, denied officially, began to exist everywhere else. What made this injustice cut so deeply was not only the cruelty itself, but the implication behind it, that some lives could be violated and discarded without consequence. Bumpy had spent his life navigating a world built on that assumption, and he had learned that the most effective resistance was not spectacle, but exposure. Systems collapse not when they are attacked head-on, but when their contradictions are calmly illuminated. He began to prepare, not for confrontation, but for revelation. By the end of the week, Harlem stood at a crossroads it had visited too many times before. Fear urged silence. Anger urged destruction. Bumpy offered a third path, quieter and far more demanding. He asked people to stand without shouting, to remember without exaggeration, and to insist calmly, relentlessly, that dignity was not negotiable. Many doubted it would work. Some feared it would make things worse. Bumpy accepted that doubt without argument. Leadership, he believed, was not about convincing everyone, but about moving forward anyway. Isaiah watched all of this from the margins, still wounded, still uncertain, but no longer invisible. For the first time, he understood that his pain was not being used as fuel for chaos, but as a reason for restraint. That realization did not erase what had been done to him, but it transformed it into something heavier and more meaningful. His suffering was now part of a larger stand, one that refused to surrender dignity even when stripped of protection. As Harlem settled into an uneasy quiet, the forces that had dismissed the incident grew comfortable in their assumption that nothing would come of it. They mistook calm for surrender and silence for acceptance. They did not yet realize that Bumpy Johnson was not waiting for permission, nor for the right moment to strike, but for the moment when truth itself would be impossible to ignore. The stage was set, not for violence, but for a reckoning that would arrive without warning, carried not by fists or guns, but by words, memory, and the unyielding weight of dignity. And somewhere in that waiting, unseen and underestimated, the balance of power began to shift. The second week did not announce itself with sirens or headlines. It arrived quietly, almost politely, as if Harlem itself were holding its breath, unsure whether exhaling too soon might shatter something fragile. The streets looked the same, the shops opened on time, the music still drifted from open windows, but underneath it all ran a current of unease that people felt more than they spoke about. This was no longer just about what had been done to one young man. It was about what the city had decided to ignore, and how long that silence could survive before it collapsed under its own weight. Bumpy Johnson understood that silence better than anyone. He had learned long ago that power reveals itself not when it shouts, but when it refuses to answer. What unsettled him was not the cruelty of the men who had humiliated his nephew. Cruelty was crude, predictable, almost lazy, but the smooth indifference of the institutions that followed. The paperwork that vanished. The officers who suddenly forgot names and faces. The polite smiles that said, without words, this will go no further. In that erasure, Bumpy saw the real danger, because a system that can make a man disappear on paper can do far worse in reality. He moved carefully now, not because he was afraid, but because every step mattered. Each morning he walked Harlem streets, stopping where conversations thinned when he approached, sitting where men pretended not to watch him. He listened more than he spoke. He let people talk themselves into honesty because he knew that truth, when forced, hardens into defensiveness, but when invited, it spills out with surprising clarity. Barbers spoke of officers who had warned them to mind their business. A church elder recalled a captain who had laughed softly when the complaint was mentioned. None of it was loud, none of it dramatic, but together it formed a pattern, too clean to dismiss. Isaiah felt the weight of those days in a different way. His body healed faster than his sense of self, and he struggled with the quiet moments when memory crept in uninvited. There were nights when sleep refused him, and mornings when the mirror felt like an accusation. Yet even in his silence something was changing. He watched how his uncle moved, how restraint could command attention more effectively than rage ever had. For the first time, Isaiah began to understand that dignity was not passive. It was active, disciplined, and sometimes exhausting. He began to sit straighter, speak a little louder, and refuse to disappear, even when it would have been easier to shrink. The injustice sharpened midweek, when word reached Harlem that the men responsible had been seen openly celebrating, laughing in places where they knew they would be noticed. It was not just arrogance, it was instruction. A message meant to travel fast. Nothing will happen. This is how the world works. Anger flared in the neighborhood, raw and volatile, and for a moment it seemed as though the old cycle might return: retaliation, followed by crackdowns, headlines followed by funerals. Bumpy watched that anger rise, and he did something that confused even his closest allies. He discouraged it. Anger, he told them quietly, is what they're prepared for. He did not lecture or shame. He simply explained that violence would turn the story into something smaller, easier to control. They want noise, he said. We're going to give them memory. It was not an easy thing to ask, and some walked away unconvinced, but many stayed because they trusted the calm in his voice more than the fire in their own chests. It was during this tense waiting that Dutch Schultz re-entered the orbit, not through spectacle, but through coincidence carefully arranged. The two men met in a room that had seen many kinds of negotiations, yet this one felt different. There was no swagger, no tests of dominance. Dutch, for all his reputation, recognized something in Bumpy that money and violence could not buy: moral authority that unsettled people because it exposed the emptiness of their own justifications. They spoke of pressure, of institutions. that pretended to be blind until light was applied from the right angle. Dutch did not offer muscle, he offered access. Bumpy accepted neither as a favor, but as a tool to be used sparingly and without gratitude. The turning point did not come with a confrontation in the street, but with a meeting no one thought would matter. A closed-door gathering at a precinct, routine on the surface, dull enough to attract no attention. Bumpy attended alone. No entourage. No witnesses meant to intimidate. He sat patiently while men spoke around him, watched as they avoided his eyes, and waited until the room grew uncomfortable with his silence. Then he spoke, not accusing, not threatening, but describing. He described files that do not vanish without hands guiding them. He described newspapers that thrive on contradiction. He described how a city that prides itself on order should be careful what kind of disorder it quietly protects. His voice never rose. His words were measured, almost gentle. He said only that a young man's name had been misplaced, and that names, once displaced, have a habit of resurfacing in places no one can control. He let the implication breathe on its own. There was no demand at the end of his statement, no ultimatum. He simply stopped speaking and waited. The silence that followed was heavier than any threat. Men shifted in their seats. A captain cleared his throat. Someone asked for a file number, carefully, as if touching something fragile. By the time Bumpy stood to leave, the room felt altered, not because he had won, but because the balance had shifted. Fear had not been introduced, responsibility had. That afternoon, files began to reappear. Testimonies were re-entered without polishing the edges. Isaiah's name was spoken correctly, aloud, in rooms where it had been avoided for days. It was not justice in its final form, but it was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is the first crack in any wall built on denial. Harlem felt the change before it fully understood it. Conversations softened, shoulders eased. Bumpy's sister wept quietly when she learned that her son would no longer be erased. Isaiah, hearing the news, did not cheer or celebrate. He simply closed his eyes and breathed, feeling something settle back into place. His dignity had not been restored by force or spectacle, but by insistence, calm, relentless insistence that his life mattered. As the week ended, those who had assumed the storm had passed began to realize they had misjudged the weather. This was no outburst that could be waited out. It was a memory being anchored, a truth being quietly made permanent. Bumpy walked Harlem. Again, unchanged in posture, unchanged in pace, yet followed now by a deeper silence, the kind that comes when people understand that something important has been reclaimed. But the story was not finished. Acknowledgement is only the beginning, and Bumpy knew that systems rarely surrender all at once. What had started as an attempt to erase one young man had become a test of whether dignity could stand against convenience, whether restraint could outlast cruelty. As Harlan leaned into that question, the next chapter waited, heavier and more demanding, promising that the calm of this moment was not an ending, but the gathering of strength before something even greater was asked of them all. By the time the third week arrived, Harlem no longer felt suspended in uncertainty. It felt watched. Not watched in the obvious way, with patrol cars idling too long or unfamiliar faces lingering on corners, but watched in the quieter, more suffocating sense that comes when power realizes it has been challenged and has not yet decided how to respond. The acknowledgement Bumpy had forced into existence had disturbed an order that depended on silence. And disturbed systems do not correct themselves out of conscience. They correct themselves out of self-preservation. Bumpy knew this. He also knew that the most dangerous moment is not when injustice is ignored, but when it is partially recognized and then deliberately stalled. Isaiah felt that danger before he could name it. Doors that had begun to open now hesitated again. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. There was no new harm, no fresh humiliation, but there was pressure, subtle, persistent, designed to remind him that acknowledgement could be withdrawn just as quietly as it had been granted. A clerk misplaced a follow-up document. An officer suggested, with a practiced smile, that pushing further might complicate things. Isaiah understood the message clearly. Be grateful for what you've been given. Don't ask for more. It took everything in him not to retreat, not to decide that survival was enough. Bumpy watched this shift with the patience of a man who had seen it before. Partial justice, he believed, was often more dangerous than none at all because it created the illusion of progress while preserving the original imbalance. He did not react immediately. Instead, he slowed down even further, as if refusing to be rushed by a system that thrived on fatigue. He visited people who had nothing to gain by speaking. He listened to those who had learned long ago to expect disappointment. What he gathered was not outrage, but pattern and understanding of how power applied pressure without ever leaving fingerprints. The deeper conflict revealed itself gradually. This was no longer about whether Isaiah's suffering would be acknowledged. It was about whether that acknowledgement would lead anywhere meaningful, or whether it would be buried under procedure and time until it became harmless. The men responsible had begun to sense the shift, and they responded the only way such men know how, by leaning harder on the mechanisms that had always protected them. Promotions were discussed, transfers quietly arranged. The future, they assumed, would erase the past. Bumpy understood that confrontation now would be a mistake. Violence would fracture the fragile progress already made. Public outrage would allow the system to retreat behind familiar defenses. What was needed was something far more unsettling: exposure without accusation, truth without theatrics. He began to prepare for that moment, not by gathering weapons, but by gathering witnesses, not people who would shout, but people who would remember. Dutch Schultz sensed the tension tightening long before it broke. He had built his life on reading rooms, on knowing when a smile meant confidence and when it meant fear. When he crossed paths with Bumpy again, he saw not urgency, but resolve, the kind that does not rush because it knows time is working in its favor. Dutch offered to accelerate things, to apply pressure that would force a result. Bumpy declined, gently but firmly. Too fast, he said, and they'll call it chaos. Let them walk themselves into daylight. Dutch, for once, did not argue. Even he understood that some battles are won by patience, so disciplined it looks like restraint to fools. Isaiah reached his own turning point one evening when he realized that silence, even dignified silence, could become another form of disappearance if left unchecked. He spoke to his uncle not with anger, but with clarity. He said he was tired of being the subject of whispers and paperwork, tired of being handled instead of heard. Bumpy listened, pride and concern crossing his face in equal measure. He did not discourage the boy. Instead, he asked him a single question: whether he was ready to be seen not as a victim, but as a witness. Isaiah did not answer immediately. When he finally did, his voice was steady. The moment arrived not in a courtroom or a street, but in a place designed to be unremarkable, a civic forum meant to reassure the public that everything was functioning as it should. Bumpy attended again alone, his posture calm, his presence unignorable. When invited to speak, he did not recount the incident. He did not name names. Instead, he spoke about process, about how systems claim legitimacy by their consistency, about how dignity depends not on outcomes alone, but on whether truth is allowed to travel intact from one room to another. Then, without raising his voice, he invited Isaiah to stand. The room shifted instantly. This was not part of the plan. Isaiah did not speak long. He did not dramatize his pain. He described facts, plainly, without embellishment, without accusation. The power of his words came not from emotion, but from restraint. Every sentence denied the room its usual defenses. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to discredit. Silence followed, not the comfortable silence of dismissal, but the uneasy silence of recognition. In that moment, Bumpy did nothing. He did not nod, did not speak, did not even look around the room. His stillness was the final pressure. It said, without words, "You have heard this now. What you do next will define you." The system, faced with a truth it could no longer pretend, was abstract, began to shift again. This time, not out of fear of exposure, but out of fear of being permanently marked by its refusal. What followed was not immediate justice, but irreversible movement. Oversight was requested by people who had never asked for it before. Records were reviewed by eyes newly aware of their weight. The men who had assumed time would erase consequences began to understand that time, guided carefully, could do the opposite. Isaiah sat back down, hands trembling slightly, and for the first time since the night everything began, he felt something stronger than survival. He felt agency. Harlem absorbed the moment slowly, reverently. There were no celebrations, no declarations of victory. Instead, there was a shared understanding that something had changed at its core. The injustice had not been defeated by force, but by refusal, the refusal to disappear, the refusal to be rushed, the refusal to trade dignity for quiet. Bumpy walked home that night alone, the city settling around him like an old companion. He knew the final chapter had not yet been written. Systems rarely yield without one last attempt to reassert control. But he also knew that the most powerful line had already been crossed. Truth had been spoken aloud, intact and undeniable, and once that happens, no amount of silence can ever fully contain it. The question that remained was not whether justice would come, but what it would cost, and who would be brave enough to pay that price without losing themselves in the process. The final week arrived without the relief people expected. There was no sense of closure in Harlem, no collective exhale, only a deeper quiet that felt heavier than fear. It was the quiet that follows truth once it has been spoken aloud, when the world must decide whether it will honor what it has heard, or punish those who dared to say it. Bumpy Johnson understood this kind of silence intimately. It was the most dangerous phase of any reckoning, because it tempted people to believe the hardest work was already done. In reality, this was the moment when character, not courage, not anger, but character would be tested most severely. The pressure returned in subtler forms. Phone calls that ended too quickly, meetings postponed without explanation, invitations withdrawn politely, with smiles that never reached the eyes. It was not retaliation in the crude sense. It was erosion, the slow attempt to wear down resolve by exhausting patience. Isaiah felt it keenly. He had spoken his truth, stood in the open, and now sensed the invisible hands trying to guide him back into the margins. Friends cautioned him to lie low. Well-meaning voices told him he had already done enough. Each suggestion carried the same implication: don't make them uncomfortable any longer. Bumpy saw the toll it was taking. He watched his nephew wrestle with doubt, not about what had happened, but about whether insisting on dignity was worth the cost. One evening, as they sat together without conversation, Bumpy finally spoke. He told Isaiah that justice rarely arrives as a reward for bravery. It arrives as a responsibility placed on those who refuse to retreat. He explained that the world often forgives cruelty faster than it forgives disruption, and that standing firm would likely make Isaiah less popular, not more. But, he added softly, you won't forget who you are. That, he said, was the only thing no system could ever return once it was surrendered. The decisive moment came unexpectedly, not from an act of resistance, but from an act of cowardice. An internal review quietly initiated and never meant to surface was leaked, not by activists or agitators, but by someone inside who had grown tired of carrying the weight of unspoken truth. The document did not accuse, it did not dramatize. It simply laid out inconsistencies, omissions, and deliberate delays so plainly that denial became impossible. What made it devastating was not what it said, but how calmly it said it. The city could no longer pretend the issue was unresolved. It was unresolved by choice. The response was swift, not because morality had suddenly awakened, but because exposure had reached a point of no return. Officials who had avoided responsibility now competed to claim it. Statements were released acknowledging failures in process. Corrective measures were announced with language carefully scrubbed of guilt. It was not the apology Isaiah deserved, but it was movement, real, public, irreversible movement. The men who had assumed anonymity would protect them found themselves reassigned, scrutinized, quietly removed from positions that relied on unquestioned authority. No spectacle accompanied their fall. It was administrative, procedural, and devastating in its ordinariness. Harlem received the news not with celebration, but with something closer to reverence. People gathered in small groups, speaking softly, as if loud voices might somehow undo what had been achieved. Isaiah's mother wept again, but this time, her tears carried release rather than despair. Isaiah himself felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. Justice, he realized, was not triumphant. It was heavy. It demanded acknowledgement of pain without offering the comfort of forgetting it. Yet in that weight, he felt restored. He had not been erased. He had been heard. Bumpy remained what he had always been: composed, measured, quietly present. He did not claim credit, did not offer commentary, did not allow the moment to be turned into myth. When asked how he felt, he replied simply that dignity had been returned to where it belonged. That was all. Those who understood him knew that this restraint was not humility for show, but principle. Justice to Bumpy was not a trophy. It was maintenance. Something that had to be tended carefully, without ego, or it would rot into something else entirely. In the days that followed, Harlem changed in ways that were almost imperceptible. People spoke a little more openly. Young men walked with slightly less caution. Mothers slept a little easier, knowing that silence had not won this time. The system itself did not transform overnight. Bumpy would never pretend otherwise, but it had been reminded of something it preferred to forget. That dignity, once asserted collectively and calmly, could not be quietly dismissed. The final image of that chapter was not dramatic. It was Bumpy and Isaiah walking together down a familiar street, neither speaking, the city moving around them as it always had. There were no cheers, no applause, no closing arguments. Just two men, one older, one younger, carrying forward a truth that had been tested and survived. Harlem watched them pass, understanding that what had been reclaimed was not power, but respect, and that respect, once restored, leaves a longer legacy than fear ever could. And in that quiet, lasting resolution, the story found its end not in victory, but in dignity, not in violence, but in resolve, and not in noise, but in a silence that finally meant justice had been done.